Hello friends, my name is Ajay and welcome to the second video in the Introduction to Angular series. In the previous video, I showed you how to get started and install all of the necessary things to get started working with Angular. But in this video, we're actually going to get started with the most fundamental building block of Angular web applications, which is the component. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so the first thing that we want to really think about is how web applications are actually structured. Right? So typically, in a web application that does not use Angular and just kind of uses basic files, including if you ever took like an intro web development class, you probably learned of 3 different files when put together create a website. So I'm going to kind of do an overview of these again because we will see them in our Angular application. So the first one is going to be what we call the HTML file. So we have like this here, we have HTML, that is our first type of file. Then oftentimes you'll see a CSS file, and then typically you see a JavaScript file. Now what do each of these files actually do? Right? So combine together, so let's say that we take the addition of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, this is going to give us a web page. So this will give us our traditional web page that we're used to seeing, right? So this is a web page. Now, each of these components have a very specific and defined role to create our web page. The first one is HTML defines the structure. It defines the structure of our web pages. What type of elements or what type of UI elements actually show up on our website. So, for example, if we wanted to add text or if we wanted to add a link or an image, right? Any of those things, those are elements. Those are pieces in the structure of our website. Now, a structure alone is kind of just like a skeleton, right? Like if you look at a human body, HTML is kind of like the skeleton. But when you go to a website, right, there's often many colors, there's different layouts, and things are arranged very nicely. And that is done by our second component, which is CSS. So CSS files define the styling. So this may be working with fonts, this may be working with colors, with layout, etc. And I can kind of write that. So, example would be colors, right? Font, layout, so layout, etc. And HTML is with structure. So this may be something like, text or images or links, etc. Tables is another one. Sometimes you have tables, and that's also defined in HTML. So with structure and styling, you can pretty much create any static website, right? So a website that doesn't actually really do anything, but it may display some content, it may look nice, etc. So just HTML and CSS are required to make a static website. However, the real magic comes when we add our JavaScript file, right? And so JavaScript is going to be how we add our functionality. So for example, if we wanted to press a button and for it to do something, or if we wanted our page to actually, store some value or store some state, and then we want to maybe mutate the state. A good example is like if you're ever looking for a timer, right, on online, or perhaps you're working on a to-do list, right? Buttons to actually add and remove items to the to-do list or to set and start counting down or pause or reset your timer. That is all done with JavaScript because that is functionality. So functionality is the key piece in JavaScript that actually helps your website actually function and have some sort of purpose. So just for completeness here, I'll have examples. So action completed when a button is pressed. So when a button is pressed, perhaps you're getting some sort of external data. So maybe retrieving external data from the internet. This may be, for example, a scoreboard, like a live scoreboard for a game. So your website might be updating with the score, and so it needs to go on the internet to retrieve some data. So retrieving external data from the internet, right, etc. Now, these three types of files, when combined together, make a single web page. All right, everyone, I wanted to jump very quickly to a real example that shows you how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are combined, or at least HTML and CSS. So this is my website, and you can go to pretty much any website on the internet for this. And what I want to do is I want to open the inspector. So when you are in Safari or in Chrome, you need to make sure that you have developer tools enabled. So in my case, I can access this in Safari by going to Safari Settings and going to the Advanced tab. And then right here, there should be a check mark that says Show Features for Web Developers. And so that opens this Develop tab right over here. Now, if you're on Chrome, you can also go into your Chrome settings and turn on the developer setting in your Chrome browser. I will provide a link in the description so that you can turn it on if you don't already have it on. And once you do that in both browsers, when you right-click anywhere on your page, you should see this option that says Inspect Element, right? So you should see Inspect Element right here. And when you press Inspect Element, you will notice that it opens this window. If you're on Chrome or if you're on Safari, it should open a similar window, where on the left-hand side, we have HTML, right? And kind of here in the center, we may have some of our styling. So remember that HTML defines the structure for our web page. And so you'll notice that as I begin highlighting over some of these lines, you will notice certain elements on our website actually being highlighted. So you can see here, as I scroll down, right, different elements are being highlighted. So for example, here, I can open this div, and now as I move from this div to this div, we have a smaller part of our website. I can continue going into this div, and now you can see that I'm highlighting over that text area, kind of on the right-hand side of the website. I can continue going in, and now you see that I've highlighted this what we call this chipset. I go inside of this even more, and eventually I am at my text. Right? The more I open these elements, I'm eventually going to reach the text that is inside right here. So you can see that this is the raw text for the website. And with HTML, we're going to be using HTML quite a bit. And so if you're not familiar with HTML already, I highly recommend checking out the website that I'm going to link in the description, because it talks about HTML in a very in-depth way. The main thing with HTML is it's not necessarily too hard to get started with. You just have to know the different types of tags, what we call tags, right? So anytime we have this open, this open angled bracket along with some text, this is what's known as a tag. And a tag defines a certain element or a certain single, piece on our website. So for example, if I click on this button in Safari, I can now highlight over specific items. And you can see that as I highlight, for example, this image, right, there's kind of this blue box around it. This is one element on our website. I can go over here, this text is another paragraph, or another element, right? This paragraph is another element. This paragraph right here is another element. And together, all of these elements end up making a website. Now remember that according to our diagram, CSS defines the styling of our web page. And I would like to show you something pretty cool. So on my inspector here, if I press this button and checkmark Disable CSS, you'll actually see what this website looks like without any CSS applied. So this is HTML only. You can see that this image takes up the entire screen. We have our buttons, which are just kind of floating at the top here. And we have all of our items are right aligned. You can see these icons are just kind of dropped in here. So without any styling, right, our website looks pretty bad. And it's, there's no styling at all here. And so this is why CSS is extremely important, because it allows us to provide layouts and styling, colors, fonts, etc. to our website, so that it doesn't just look as if it is, plain Times New Roman text put into a website here. So as we're going to be working through this series, we will be working with CSS as well. And if you haven't used CSS, most of the time HTML and CSS tutorials are combined, and I'll provide a link for CSS tutorials as well. In general though, HTML and CSS are not too in-depth languages to learn, so it shouldn't take you too much time to become a bit more proficient with it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we jump back into our Angular code is how websites generally work in terms of pages. So I'm going to refresh my page here, and I'm actually going to close my inspector. So this is my website, and what I want to point your attention to is the URL. So here, right, this says ajaygandecha.com, and there's nothing kind of following my URL. However, if I were to press on any of these tabs, such as the Apps tab, you'll notice that my URL changes to have /apps. If I click on teaching, it would show /teaching. If you go to any other website as well, like if I go to apple.com, for example, you'll see at the base there's nothing it kind of following this URL. However, if I were to press on something, right, the education store, you'll now see that we have more items attached to the end of our URL. And so this is a very important thing that I want to highlight with what we call routing. So this would be a very important concept in Angular as we're working in future videos. So we have routing. And what happens with routing is we're giving a URL from the internet. So for example, let's say that this is a website that's just called helloworld.com. So you would have your normal route, which is HTTPS, right? And then hello world, HTTPS helloworld.com. I'll add back my text at the top, routing. And what happens if we want to redirect to other pages on our site? Well, they're added at different what we call routes. So these are routes right here. And our normal page is just at /, right? That is just our base route. That is kind of what we call the index. And oftentimes when you're creating websites with static HTML, the page that shows up at that blank slash is called the index.html. So this is like our index.html a lot of times, index.html. Now that can be overwritten, but by default is that. But for example, if I wanted to go to a page that says, maybe the About page. So an About page, you would add a new route. So a new page would be associated with the URL, right, helloworld.com/about. Same thing maybe with contact or privacy policy. So privacy policy. And what happens is you have individual pages. So let's say this is our home page. Right, this is our home page right here. This is associated with this route. You may have an About page, and this About page is also associated with the About route. You could have, so this might be About, right? This might be Home. Then you might have a page for Contact. So, right, this may say Contact, and this is associated with the Contact route. And then we can add, let's say, a privacy policy. So I'll just put a little lock here to abbreviate, and we have privacy policy. And so what you'll notice is a website kind of has these pages associated with a specific URL or a specific route. And this becomes very important in Angular because what will happen is we will create specific pages, but then we want to associate it with a route so that when a user types in the route in the browser, we're able to show the correct page on the screen. Now, this system where we connect routes to pages is really important because in Angular, we have an element called the router outlet. So we have router outlet. And what router outlet does is depending on what URL a user has typed in, we are going to show a specific page. So for example, router outlet would go inside of our main HTML file. But then if a user had, let's say, typed in just the route that's like a slash, that may take us to a new page. So this might be our slash route, and this would take us to a new page. For example, our home page, right? So this might take us to our home page. Or we may have another route that is, say, about. So again, we have about here. And this may take us to our, this may take us to our about page right here. And so on. So we may, depending on the route that we have, we would end up showing a new page. And for very large applications, you could see that this expands quite a bit and we have new pages. But this is a very important thing to note because as we add new pages, our entry point for our application is going to show this router outlet element. And then from the router outlet element, we're going to show all of the different pages on kind of on top of each other. So really in the base, in our app, there is kind of this page that is all the way at our bottom layer. So when we load our site, this is what we call our app component. And I'm going to be getting to what components are in a second. But we have our app component. This is the main entry point of our app. So when you load the app, it's going to show the component. But then the router outlet, which is kind of sitting on top of it. So this is our router. Actually, let me see if I can make this a bit better. I'll actually abbreviate this as RO, that way it just fits. We have router outlet. Then depending on the route, so depending on the supplied route that the user types in, it's going to show a new web page on top. So it's going to show a specific page on top of it. And so that's a very important thing to remember so that, you know, as we're working more in Angular and we add more pages to our site, kind of understand how all of these things are working. Now, what this allows us to do as well is in our app component, if we wanted to, for example, add a top bar, right? Like a navigation bar, we can have our router outlet on the page, but we can also have another element on our page. So then what would happen is you would have our regular, you would have your regular page. Maybe you have some sort of nav bar at the top. So this is like our nav bar. And then you put your router outlet here. And so therefore, you can click on the nav bar and the nav bar stays, but then the page underneath ends up changing. So I used this word component when I talked about app component. So what really is a component? Well, in Angular, a component is the most basic fundamental building block of our application, and it essentially combines a UI with some UI functionality. And so together, a component makes up a certain user interface, and it has certain actions associated with it. Now, you'll remember that when we talked about those three components of a web page, remember how we had HTML, which was our structure, CSS, which is our styling, and together those two make up our UI, and then you have JavaScript, which is going to provide the functionality. But that combination is the same combination that ends up creating a component. Because remember, a component is UI plus functionality. So in order to make a component in Angular, so a component ends up having our HTML, so HTML plus CSS, and then associated with it as well is a TypeScript file. So remember, instead of JavaScript with Angular, we're working with TypeScript. But in terms of the purpose, it serves the same purpose as what JavaScript would serve. So together, all of these things make a component. Now we can jump into our we can jump into our Angular application inside of VS Code that we created in the previous video, and we can kind of see where all of these pieces fall together. You'll notice that on the right-hand side, you will have these files right here. So these are some files that you'll see this is automatically generated. And you'll notice that all of them have this app.component and then dot some sort of extension. So we have CSS as an extension, right? So CSS, we have HTML as an extension, and then we have two TypeScript files. And together, all of these files together, all of these files together create the app component. Now, where this is actually defined in our code is going to be in this app.component.ts file, which is our main TypeScript file. And you'll see that we have this class right here, this TypeScript class, which is called app component. And then on top of it, this is the main thing that makes this a component in Angular, which is the component decorator. So you'll notice that we have this @component, so @component above our class, and this makes this class below it a component. Now, the cool thing about the decorator is that it supplies certain items into it. And I won't be explaining all of them right now, but some of them. Mainly these two, template URL and style URL. And what you'll notice is that template URL links to an HTML file, right? We provide a file path to an HTML file, and this points to my app component HTML file right here. Then I have my style URL, which links to a CSS file. And this links to this CSS file right here. So you can see that my component.html or my component.ts file is linking to my CSS file right over here, and it's linking to my HTML file right over here. So when we take all of these three things combined, that makes our component. So our template and our style define our CSS. So you can see our CSS right now is empty. And in our HTML, we have all of this extra text. All right, so you may remember if we type into our terminal, ngserve open, what this will do is this will actually open our website. And I'll press allow right here, and you'll see that this opens up our website in a browser of your choice. What I'm going to do now, though, is I'm going to delete all of this HTML. I'm going to delete everything. And we're going to start from scratch. The first thing I want to include is my router outlet. My router outlet again, because remember, the router outlet is how we are able to get other components to show up on our site. And above this, I will just have a title, and I'll make this an H1 element for a header, and I'll just say hello world. Now, if I save my app and I open it again, so you can hold down the control or command button and press that link to open it, you'll now see that my website says hello world. I can add styling to this, and just to prove that this works, I'll go here and I'll say H1, and let's just say that I make the color of this brown, and I were to reopen my site. And if you have your browser open, actually, it should automatically, I'll just go into history and open this. You'll see now that it shows up as brown. A cool thing, though, is that I don't actually have to close this browser. If I were to change the color here to, let's say, blue, and I switch back to, Chrome, it automatically updates the site. So you don't have to keep constantly closing and reopening, it automatically updates. And so now, this very basic example, you can see the use of HTML and CSS together, as well as our component TS file actually working to make our site. And you might be wondering, well, what is how is this actually showing up and how is this connected? Remember that main.ts, as we talked about kind of in the first video, is the main entry point. So when your application runs, main.ts is what runs. And inside of main.ts, we have this bootstrap application, and we provide our app component right here. So our app component is the first component that's loaded up on the page when we create our application. Now, components, and we'll see in the next video, we can combine components with routes. So once we have our components, so we kind of, if I create a category here as this is a component, right? And a component has our HTML, it has our CSS, and it has our TypeScript. This makes a single component. And what we can do is we can attach a route to this component, so that when I load a certain URL on my website, we can actually see different pages show up on our screen. And so in the next video, I'm going to show you how to create your own components from scratch and how to hook it up with routing so that we can work with different URLs and different pages in our site. All right, that should be all for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Feel free to like and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you all in the next one.